Hello, Tubby and Coos fans. It's me, Candace, coming at you again with another virtual author event. And I know I always say I'm excited, but I am particularly excited today to be talking with Jo Walton. I'm a big fan of Jo's, and this new book is so good. You're all going to love it. So I'm talking with Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Award winner Jo Walton, whose newest book is Or What You Will. This is what it looks like. Jo won Hugo and Nebula Awards in 2012 for her novel Among Others, which I know a lot of you have read. And before that, she won the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer, and her novel Tooth and Claw won the World Fantasy Award in 2004. The novels of her Small Change sequence, Farthing, Halfpenny, and Half a Crown, have won acclaim ranging from national newspapers to the Romantic Times Critics' Choice Award. And she's a native of Wales and currently lives in Montreal. And this book, Or What You will all love it. I can't wait to sell it to you all. It is out now, and it is an utterly original novel about how stories work, how they're brought forth from writers' depths, where they come from, where they take us. And it delightfully dramatizes the deep processes common to most writers and how their characters speak to them, with all the danger and drama and charm that comes with it. This book is wonderful. I can't wait for y'all to read it. And thank you so much, Jo. Welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
And so can you tell us, to start off, 2 or 3 things about yourself that are maybe fun facts or that you think people should know?
This is my 15th novel, and I come from Wales, but I emigrated to Montreal in 2002, so I'm a Canadian now. I did a bio recently where I said, I like books and travel and food and travel and seeing my friends and travel.
And for this book, you traveled, right? So I want to talk about that in a minute. But first, let's talk about just the book in general and what it's about. I feel like a lot of your writing is like this, but this book really feels like a conversation between the reader and the narrator. It felt like a conversation to me. The narrator of this book is essentially an imaginary friend of the writer that the book is about. Her name is Sylvia. The narrator is unnamed. So how did the idea for this story come about? Tell us a little bit about it and what it's about. And I'm wondering if you have imaginary friends who help you write as well.
Everybody keeps asking me this. So I was on a panel about writing with the writer Jim MacDonald, who writes with his wife Deborah Doyle, and they're the authors of the Mage Worlds books. And I was on a panel with Jim, and he said that he has a cast of characters in his head. And when he's writing a new book, when he's writing a new story, he auditions them for the parts in his book. And I suddenly pictured this as being like a Commedia dell'arte team in his head, because he was saying, and I have the old man, and I have the hero, and I have the girl, and I was sort of partly thinking, oh, good grief. And then I was thinking, what do they do in between engagements? What do they do when they're waiting around for him to write another book? And it was like the way he was talking about them. He was talking about them like they were actors and like they were real. And so I was immediately starting to think, what do they do in his head? What do they do? What is their day job when they're waiting around? And then I thought, the thing that this book is about, what happens when he dies? What happens to them if they're, in his head? And I kind of treat in a way in this book in terms of whether he is real, whether he's real, because reading it, he's talking to you, the reader, and you just accept the fact that he's real because he's a character in the book, but you're reading a book. It's
Right.
normal for you to be reading a book about a character and they're real in terms of the book within the book.
Oh yeah, he feels real. I mean, this narrator, that's what I'm saying. It felt like I was having a conversation with this person who felt very real. And that's the question. And you know, it's like, well, this person feels real to me. This person's real to Sylvia, I think. So you know, so who's to say that they're not real? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And to answer your other question, I had an imaginary friend when I was a kid. And when I am writing a book, my characters are very real to me and I might have conversations with them. But I don't keep casting the same characters in different parts in my head, not mostly. So I don't really tend to have characters like him. I've got specific characters from specific books, which is a bit different.
Got it. I had an imaginary friend as a kid too, and my imaginary friend's name was Bravissimo Fishimo. So that's a fun fact for everyone watching out there.
Great name.
Yes, and I don't know where the name came from. I sort of just came up. It was a kid's thing that I just came up with, and to me, he was like a short little character, like a dwarf from like D&D, like Dungeons and Dragons, or like from a fantasy world. That's what Bravissimo Fishimo was. And we went on lots of adventures and it was fun. So I believe in imaginary friends.
I think that's a really normal thing for kids. I think so many kids do have imaginary friends, and it's nothing but healthy for them.
Yeah, I think so too. So tell us about your process in writing this book, because there's so much here. Like there's so many threads. We have the overarching plot of the narrator who lives in the mind of Sylvia the novelist. And then there's Sylvia's life story. There's this alternate Florence novel that Sylvia is writing. So there's just layers upon layers of things that are beautifully woven together. So I'm just wondering about your process. Like, how did you write this? Did you write all these threads separately? How did you keep track of everything?
So I generally write beginning at the beginning and going straight through to the end. And I messed that up a little bit with this book, and I wrote a bit that was ahead, and I had to keep going back and filling in when I'd done that bit out of sequence. But basically, no, I wrote it as you read it, in the order that you read it, pretty much. With a caveat that I messed up a little bit, but there is the present time thread in which she is in Florence. She is old. He's trying to tell you a story that is set in the world of her first novel, and then he's also trying to tell you her life story. So it's her life story from the point of view of the imaginary friend who's been in her head the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to get her on the page. That's his plan. He's trying to get her on the page. So there's her life story, which is, happened over the last 70 years, and he's filling that all in for you. And it alternates between that and the story that he's trying to tell and that she's trying to tell in the fantasy world, the fantasy version of Florence. And then the everyday life is going on in Florence. So yeah, there are a lot of threads. Now you mentioned it, yeah.
Yeah, there are a bunch, and that's why I was like, man, did you write like the fantasy, novel first? Because that has its own plot and its own thread. And then, Sylvia's life story, and then the narrator trying to get Sylvia onto the page because he's afraid that if she dies, he's going to die with her. So he's got this whole big plan to prevent that from happening. And it jumps back and forth between all of these things. And so it's amazing to me that you you just wrote it in the order it's in, and because it jumps back and forth. And that's so interesting to me. I love to hear about processes and how writers' brains work.
So originally, I didn't have what is now chapter 2 as early as it is now. There was more of just him talking and things before I had anything that was in the other world. And I decided to move that forward so that you would know that you were getting some stuff in a fantasy world, and it wouldn't be a big surprise when you didn't hit it until I think chapter 6 that you originally hit that. And I also messed a bit of it later on, and I had to sort of reshape it. But basically, I did write it in the order that you read it in.
And that's fascinating to me. And what came to you first? Was it the characters, or the setting, or the story, like the plot? Like what was the first thing that came, and how did everything sort of populate around that?
So, as very often for me, what I start off with is kind of the character in the situation. So once I thought of him, he was in her head, and he had this problem of what was going to happen when she died. And that was really my very first thought about this book. And then I started writing the beginning of it, the first chapter, without any idea really what else was going to be in it and where it was going to go. I just sort of wanted to write it, and I'd been stuck with writing something else, and I really wanted to write this, so I just wrote that down. And it was very alive, and I was excited to be doing it. And then I worked out what I was going to do and how it was going to work, and how meta it was going to be, and how he was going to address the reader, and sort of where I was going with it. And I thought that was February of 2018. And the year before, I had been in Florence in the summer, the 2 years before. I'd been in Florence in the summer for part of the summer, working on my novel Lent, which came out last year, which is a very solidly researched historical fantasy where all the history is as correct as I could get it. But I had a wonderful time in Florence writing it, where I would do what I describe her doing. I would go to San Marco or somewhere in the morning, and then I'd go home to my rental apartment and write in the afternoon. And I thought, I'm going to send her to Florence and have her do that, and then I can go to Florence and work on the book, and it'll all be totally legitimate. It'll absolutely be necessary research, and I'll have to be there. And then I thought, I will put in some real world events when I'm in Florence. I'll sort of I'll go and look at places, and then I'll put in her going there and looking at them and what she thinks. And I'll do that with some real world stuff as it happens and put it in the book, which led me to some of the best things that are in the book. Because when you make things up, you've only got as much as you can think of. Whereas when you take things from the real world is so big and complicated and fun and full of different things. You get things you never would have thought of. So that was actually and it was something I hadn't done before. I'd done it with using real history in other books, which again gives you the practical real world when you're using real history. But I'd never actually done it with real-time things. I never put the real plumber in the book when I needed the plumber. I never put the chair. The chair is absolutely real, the whole saga of the chair. And when I realized I could put the chair in the book, I was so excited. Yeah. And so I was doing that, and that was fun, and it was a new way of working.
Yeah, and that's so cool that even the chair was real, and it all felt real. And there's so much like Renaissance Florence history in it, and I don't know a lot about Italian history, so I learned a ton from this book that I didn't know. And then you have this like alternate fantastical version of Florence as well. So it was really cool to kind of see both of those, and really I wanted to like get on a plane and go to Florence immediately. I was like, I have to go to Florence now because this book, it was just like everything about
Yeah.
Florence was so wonderful that I was like, I need to go there.
The meal that they have in Teatro del Sole, not only is Teatro del Sole real, but the meal that they have towards the end of the book is a meal that I had in the summer of 2018, where I wrote down all the courses so that I made sure that that was actually a real specific meal that she could have had on that actual day. So,
That is amazing. And so
one day we'll be able to go to Florence again, and you'll be able to do all those things.
I would love to go.
We will.
And
The book where he's telling the reader to go to Florence, and I was thinking, in March, I kind of thought, should I, when I was doing the proofs of this book, and I was thinking, should I take that out because I know the reader can't go, but like in 2018, I wrote the book, I didn't know, so I left it in.
Yeah, and I think it was good. I mean, I do want to go, and one day I'll be able to go.
Yeah.
But it was great. And so how was it? Like, does it feel different to actually be in the place that you're writing about versus writing from home? Like, how was that experience?
Yes. So in all of my books, pretty much all of my books, the places in them are real places, and I'm describing places that I've really been to, and that are real. So I usually do that. That's not an unusual thing for me to do. And I'd specifically done it with the Savonarola book with Lent, where I'd like spent time sitting in the courtyard where he wrote his books, reading his books, and that kind of thing, and really getting into his head. But one of the things I wanted to do with Renaissance history with this is that Lent is such a serious book using the history. I wanted to have fun with it. I wanted to play with it. I wanted to use Italian history the way that Shakespeare uses Italian history. And also, I'd read so many non-fiction books as research, not for this, but for Lent, that I wanted to sort of replicate the experience of reading a fun non-fiction book, which is not something you often get to do if you're a novelist. But I could have him telling the historical stories the way that you get in a fun, popular non-fiction book. And then I could just take a left turn into fantasy. And you're still reading it in this mode where you're reading about real people, and you're reading about Brunelleschi inventing perspective, and you're reading about Brunelleschi and Donatello, and then you're reading about the Brunelleschi and the Fat Woodcarver, which is a real story. And then when you get to Brunelleschi paint the magic painting that people can walk into, magic painting, okay, you're just like, okay, it just feels like that's real as well.
It definitely does, and that's one thing that I loved about this book is that there's all this, like you're saying, this sort of nonfiction feeling where, but it feels like you're being told the story. Like, I didn't feel like I was reading a textbook. It felt to me like a conversation. Like, this person is telling me about Italian history and all this stuff, and then all of a sudden there's a magical painting that people can walk into, and then it's a fantasy, and I was like, oh, this is so great.
The good parts version.
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned Shakespeare because this story is clearly very heavily influenced by Shakespeare. It's almost a retelling of The Tempest, for sure, and some other Shakespeare stuff. So, what does Shakespeare mean to you as a writer, and why did you choose to sort of rewrite some of his stuff here?
Well, I mean, if you say that you love Shakespeare, you sound pretentious. But I do, in fact, love Shakespeare. Shakespeare's great, you know. I really love Shakespeare, and I love seeing Shakespeare. That's another thing that's on my long list of things that alternate with travel in the things I love in my bio. Live theatre. I love live theatre. And I love Shakespeare. But when you actually see a lot of Shakespeare, Shakespeare's got this really funny view of Italy. A lot of his plays are set in this kind of fantasy Italy. So I'm sure you know that Romeo and Juliet takes place in Verona, but Verona sort of both was and wasn't like that. And Venice kind of both was and wasn't like the Merchant of Venice. So it was, but it also wasn't. And then when you've got the Tempest, you've got Shakespeare bringing magic into people who come from his imaginary Italy. And I think if I took the characters from the Tempest and Twelfth Night, both of which are plays where the ends feel to me unsatisfying, they don't feel as if they're all wrapped up and sort of over. And I could take those characters and I could put them together and I could tell a new story using those characters after the ends of those plays. I don't actually retell it, except that I make sure that you know what's happened in the Tempest, because otherwise you won't know who Caliban and Miranda are.
Right.
But you know, most people have seen the Tempest or read the Tempest, or they're aware, just from general cultural osmosis, aware of the Tempest. But again, I was just having fun, really. I was thinking those characters. I was doing this thing where the meta book, the book within the book that you're reading, that Sylvia is writing and that he's writing, that book is a sequel to books that she wrote in the late 70s and early 80s. And those books are very influenced by Shakespeare. And so I wanted you to have the feeling that what you're reading is a sequel. And in order for it to be a sequel, it's got to be familiar. But I was going to write the original books that she wrote in the 70s. So I used Shakespeare to give you, the reader, that feeling of, oh, yeah, I know what this is. I remember that. As if you were reading a sequel to a YA book that you'd read when you were 14, you know?
Yeah, that's really great. That's how, because it is how it feels. You do feel like you're reading a sequel, and that was another thing I was wondering if you had thought about those books that she had written, and you know how much you had thought those through before writing this one, which is a sequel. You know, she's writing a sequel, so that was another question that I had is like, how much thought did you put into those books that she wrote a long time ago?
No, I thought a lot about what those books would have been like, and who was in them and what happened in them. And I also know, because they're a trilogy, I know what happened at the end of each volume. So sometimes we mention things that happened in those books, like Pico conquering death is one of the things that happens in those books, and people going through the painting. But I know the shape of those stories. I don't know every detail that's in them, but I know the shape of the stories that she wrote. I didn't think about them beforehand. I thought about them while I was writing it. I sort of did the world building for Thalia, and then that kind of the whole Illyria world building implied the three books that she'd written a long time ago. I also loved the idea, I kind of fell in love with the idea that when she wrote them, the world was much more ordinary. It was much more like a normal fantasy novel, but it had had 400 years without an author to evolve and get more interesting. And I just really, really loved that idea. The idea of the evolution of the fantasy world into something more fun, more unusual and more interesting. And I got that idea from a Ursula Le Guin short story. So yeah.
And I think all of this is like genius, to use Shakespeare to have the reader feel sort of familiar and like you're reading a sequel, or to familiarize them with the world. I mean, that's like, to me, it's like, oh my gosh, you're just a genius as a writer, because that's so cool that you did that. And this, go ahead.
Some people feel too in awe of Shakespeare to play with his characters or do anything, as if he is always sort of like perfect and unapproachable, just because he's so brilliant and so good. But I love Shakespeare in a way where I don't feel in awe. I love him because I love the real things that he really does, rather than just this idea that he's the greatest ever. I mean, he is so great. Nobody could ever write like he could write, but you can still play with it. You can still sort of enjoy doing that.
Yeah, and I would think that, like, writing like Shakespeare fan fiction, right? I mean, when you connect with it, and I feel like Shakespeare's stuff on just a lie like Shakespeare as well, and I feel like it's accessible, and it's like the actual stories in there. If you really just take the stories, they're awesome. And so to be able to, sort of use that, and when you really love it, to use those things, I think is really cool.
Yeah.
And you can tell that you know it and you love it, right? Like, it's not like you take these characters and you're just going off the wall. Like, you can tell, like, you have respect for them while also like using them in your own story. And that's what's cool about it. And this book, so it's a book within a book, as we've been talking about. It's also a book about writing and a book about books. I think this book is like truly a book for book lovers, and your love for writing and books and Shakespeare and Florence, all I think really shines through in this book. So is there a reason why you wanted to sort of set this tone of like a love of writing and books and stories? Who are you trying to reach with this, or were you trying to reach anyone in particular, or were you just having fun?
I think I was just having fun. I'm sorry. I think I had these ideas and I could throw them together, and I was having such fun throwing them together and writing it. And I was just putting in things that I love because I love them. I didn't have a plan in terms of who it was gonna reach. So there is a thing with books that are meta, that almost everything that's been written in the last couple of 100 years that is meta is also very cold and distant. So if you think about Nabokov's Pale Fire, which I love, or really any meta book that you think about, they've all got this sort of cold, ironic distancing. And a few years ago, I read Diderot's Jacques Le Fataliste, which was recommended to me by Ada Palmer when we were talking about what Ada was doing with the narrator Mycroft Canner in her Terry Ignatius series that starts with Too Like the Lightning. And we have this conversation, and she said, "Oh, have you read Jack the Fatalist?" And I said, "No, I had not read Jack the Fatalist." And she said, "Oh, you must read it and see what Diderot does with the narration, with being meta." And he does it in this warm way. And Diderot was writing before the French Revolution. He was at that time. And Jacques the Fatalist is this warm, funny meta book that is very sort of friendly and loving towards the reader. And I thought, I could do that. That would be fun. Why does everybody do meta in this kind of cold, push you away way? I could do a warm meta. I want to do that. And so I had all of these things I wanted to do that sort of came together in this book. It was a fun book to write.
And you can tell, and that's why I asked that question, because you can tell how much fun you had writing it. Like, as a reader, I felt the passion and how much fun you were having, and it like really came through in it. And I was like, I feel like this was just Jo having fun with all the things that she loves, and it's a lot of these things. I've never been to Florence, but I love stories, I love books, and so it was just really cool as a reader, that all that really did come through. And this book is like obsessed with stories, and of course, as a bookseller and as an avid reader, so am I. And this is a book that loves books, and I think that's really cool. We get like stories within stories, and I love that so much. That storytelling is so important, in a lot of ways in this book. So I want to know your thoughts about stories generally, and why do you think they're so powerful in the world? Because I think they are powerful, and I think in this book particularly, stories are powerful too.
So I'm gonna give you my gelato analogy. Okay.
Okay.
So gelato is Italian ice cream, but it's made with more sugar and less fat, and it doesn't have any artificial flavors. You can't make it with artificial flavors. And when you have gelato, when you're used to ice cream, it's quite overwhelming because it's so much more intense. And it feels like it's more concentrated. So if you have raspberry gelato, it's more raspberry than a raspberry. It's really super intense. Okay. And I think that we like stories because they're doing that with life. They are more intense than intense. They are more life than life. They are like the concentrated essence, the platonic essence of our life, of the way that we live. And when you read history is very messy. It doesn't have the shape that stories have. And what I always want to do is give it a story shape. Oh, no, you can't die now of plague just randomly. You've got to finish this thing, and then somebody else finishes it. But no, I wanted to have that story shape. And because we are a storytelling species, we tell stories to small children. Small children love and understand stories, and they get a feel for how stories work. And all cultures do this, and all cultures have different shapes of stories. But within Western culture, we've got fairy tales, we've got Shakespeare, we've got certain kinds of stories that we keep telling. And it can be really great to reach out into other cultures' shapes of stories. That can be really exciting. But within our stories, we can concentrate them down, and we get that gelato effect of them just being very, very intense and powerful because of how they work, and because we know how they work. And there's a thing, there are a number of things which, when you're a reader, you get to expect and understand how they work. And when you read a particular genre, you understand it better than if it's your first book in that genre. And I bet with most people, with most books, if you stop them halfway through the book, and you say, okay, not what happens in the rest of the book, but about where in this many pages that are left do you think we'll get to the climax? About where will this happen? If you say it was a romance novel, because romance is very easy to talk about this with. Mm-hmm. If you're halfway through a romance novel, right, you know there's going to be a misunderstanding and you know they're going to get together in the end. And if you were holding the physical book, you could probably almost point at the right page from how many pages you've got left, where that would happen, just because you understand it. Whereas if you've never read a romance novel, if you've only ever read Shards of Honor, which, you know, Louis Master Bujold, I love that book, but which is sort of a romance novel, but also science fiction. If that's the only romance novel you've ever read, and now you're reading a romance novel, you're reading Georgia Hire, or you're reading something like that, you won't be able to tell where those beats fall because you're not familiar with the genre. And the more familiar with the genre you are, the better you are at doing that, even though you don't know you've got that skill. And with this book, I play with the fact that you know that and you understand that. And I play with the fact of how many pages are there left to tie this up in. Because you know it's got to be the end of the book coming. And that you've only got this little bit of space. And I deliberately play with those expectations in the shape of what I'm doing.
And you do,
and that's as well.
Yeah. And yes, and that's why I think because you specifically do that, you play with those expectations of, you know, as a science fiction and fantasy reader, pretty much mostly, I rarely read anything else. I have certain expectations of how these types of books go, and you definitely play with that. And that was really cool. And I think that's what one of the reasons, I mean, this book is unique for a lot of reasons, which is hard to do these days. But I think that it's, you know, it just does something different because it does play with readers' expectations. You feel like you're in a conversation with the narrator. You feel like, you know, there's all these different stories going on and things don't happen when you think they're going to happen. And that was really cool.
Yeah.
So what are you currently reading? Do you have any recommendations for us?
So I just read the Laurie Marks Elemental Logic series because I did a thing for the first 100 days of lockdown. I did a thing which is online, it's on Patreon, called the Decameron Project, where I wrote a frame story which connects to Or What You Will. It's got an extra chapter from Or What You Will in it that is not in the book. But I wrote a frame story that connects to Or What You Will. And I got different writers to give me stories for it, or first chapters of novels. And we split the money that we raised between the writers and Cittadina del Mundo, which is a charity in Rome that works with refugees. And we raised like thousands of dollars for them. It was so great.
That's amazing.
But also it was amazing, but it also gave people in lockdown a story every day for 100 days, like Boccaccio's Decameron. And there were some writers that most of the writers who I approached to do this were friends, and so I was familiar with their work. But some of the friends that I approached said, why don't you also ask these people? So there were some people that I wasn't familiar with. And one of those was Laurie Marks, who Ellen Kushner recommended. And Laurie Marks gave us this story that was absolutely brilliant. And I thought, boy, she's so great. What has she written? And she's written this quadrology, this set of 4 books that are called Fire Logic, Earth Logic, Water Logic, and Air Logic, in that order. And they're really different and unusual and cool. And I really, really loved reading those. And I've also just read and couldn't put down KJ Parker's 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City. Boy, was that the book I was looking for that day. I just went through that, couldn't put it down. And I do a monthly post on Tor.com, which is my reading list for the month.
Mhm.
And if you look at it, you see that during the first part of lockdown, I was having great difficulty concentrating on reading things, and I was reading way less than I normally read. And I got out of this reading slump by reading a large quantity of romance novels set in Italy that don't cost more than 99 cents on the Kindle. And, I read a ton of them, and I now know how that genre works. If I wanted to write one, I could write one. But I'm not planning to. But yeah. So, but I'm really grateful they were there. People sometimes ask me a question. Usually, people interview me about, among others, and they say, "Well, okay, what's your guilty pleasure?" And I say to them, "Why are you trying to make me feel guilty about reading? I don't feel guilty about what I read. If I want to read pornography or romance or, W.B. Griffin, I will read it. I'm not guilty about that. And I'm not guilty about comfort reading when I need comfort. And if I want to read a book called You, Me in Italy, that's just fine. I'm very glad it was there for me. And I know a lot of people have been doing a lot of rereading, which I haven't mostly. But I have read some very good things.
Yeah,
What else I've read recently?
I had a hard time too at the beginning, of lockdown with reading. For some reason, I had a really hard time. Now I'm getting back into it. It's much easier for me now, but it was hard at the beginning. And I agree about guilty pleasures. I always think that's so silly. It's like, read what you like to read. You don't have to feel guilty about it. That's silly.
Yep. Yep.
And so, what's next for you? What are you currently working on?
Well, so I wrote this book, and it had this this wonderful thing where I sort of took the things that were happening in the real world in 2018 while I was writing it, and I put them in the book, and that was exciting. So I thought, oh well, I want to try that again with some sort of political things. And I'm going to write a book set in 2020 that is about alternate worlds. And I started writing it, then this happened and completely broke my entire book.
Oh, no.
Because, I really required the world to actually carry on happening, and not go into lockdown and have a pandemic. I'm sorry, but that was not in my plan. So that book got kind of, I thought I wasn't going to be able to write it, and I thought that it had been just overtaken by events. But I've just this last few days, I've been thinking of a way that I could rescue it and make it work and have it set in a 2020 that is very near our world but doesn't have COVID. And I've been thinking about what would be different, and the things that I wanted to do and whether I can still do them. And that book is challenging in a way because I'm doing some things with it. It needs to be set in the US. And that would be the first time I had a book set in the US where I've never lived, though some of my best friends are in the US, and in normal times I visit quite a lot, but yeah. So there's that. But so maybe I'll write that and maybe I won't, and maybe I'll write something different.
That sounds cool, though. So I would love to see what you did with that, where that went.
I've written like 20,000 words of it. So, before. So we'll see.
And just to remind everyone of what we've been talking about this whole time, we're talking about Jo's newest book, Or What You Will, which is currently out. You can get it right now, and you should. It's really, really good, and you will love it, I think, as much as I did. You can find Jo online at jowaltonbooks.com if you want to learn more. And as Jo said, she also does a post. She's on Tor's blog as well, with regular posts about what she's reading, so you can check those out also. If you want to buy the book from us, which, of course, we always hope you will, you can buy it at tubbyandcoos.com and go to place an order and say, Or What You Will. You can say, I want that book that you talked about with Jo Walton, whatever. We will understand what book it is if you say that. So tubbyandcoos.com and place an order, and we will get this book to you. It's really good. I know that I like a lot of books, but this book is just, it's so different, and I think everyone will like it. I'm gonna campaign hard to get my sci-fi fantasy book club to read it, because I think they would really love this book too. So thank you so much, Jo. I don't know if anybody had any questions. That didn't seem like we were getting any. So I just kind of went with the questions that I had, since I had so many. But yes, Or What You Will, everyone buy it. It's and really everything Jo writes is good. So thank you, Jo, so much for joining me and talking to me about stories and Shakespeare and your book. And this was wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, but from Tubby and Coos, they have the best questions.
Thank you so much. I really try to, when I'm passionate, it's like, ooh, tell me all the things. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for watching. I always laugh about time travel because these videos are online. So we're coming from the past. You're probably watching sometime in the future. So thanks everyone who watched live, and anyone who's watching at any time. And hopefully you buy this book no matter when you're watching and you find out about it. So thanks again, Jo. I'm sorry?
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Y'all have a good evening.